Well, good morning. Happy to be here. I know many of you and excited for those that are giving this a try. And as mentioned, our agency, the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, is excited in about once a decade when the Envirothon topic gets to be about forestry. And we get to kind of stay a little closer to home. So this morning, what I'm hoping to do is just share with you some groundwork about Oregon's forests, help you think about this topic as we're centered around Oregon. If you have questions, feel free to ask. We'll also hopefully have some time at the end, and I'm around all day today too. So feel free to kind of just ponder those questions. And Lucas is also presenting a little more in depth on the problem. And so he'll have more of even further from where I'm going on my presentation. So this morning, I want you to think about how do we sustain Oregon's forest, and that's really what the theme of this is going to be, is about sustainability. And so I'm going to actually start with a question for you. What's so great about Oregon forest? So give me some ideas. It's green. Love it. Water. Awesome. Recreation. Wildlife, water quality, habitat, timber. Love it. So a lot of great things, but we need our Oregon forest for. They give us a lot of great benefits. And so here's some of those things: the oxygen they give, that water filtration, habitat. No one shouted out carbon sequestration. Oh, you said carbon. All right, there you go. Yay for the carbon. So wood products, recreation, aesthetics, and a lot of economic contributions. So we're going to talk a little more about some of those today. But really, I think Oregon's forests are great, but we also, know we have some challenges, but also some opportunities. And so we're going to talk about those today. I think Oregon's forests are so great. I've dedicated my career to Oregon forestry. And it has been many generations before me in my family that have worked in forestry in Oregon. But I also think a lot of times about those generations in front of us. And so I think sustainability is often trying to find that where we are today, the technology, the efficiencies, the research, what we know today, and how we're trying to make it better, and what are we wanting for that next generation and those benefits. And so when sometimes we look back, we think about, man, what were they thinking about sustainability? Was that even in their mind? But it was a different era where they were really trying to build Oregon. And so you think some of those early days, Oregon's forest is the reason that we built Portland, Salem. We have our infrastructures, we have our areas. They use those natural resources around them, and it was about locally sourced, which is an interesting concept we seem to kind of be coming back to, and I'm going to end our day talking about that locally sourced. So today, one thing when we talk about sustainability is I hope we're thinking about generations before us, generations in front of us, and how we're just really a piece of the Oregon forest, that this forestry is something that goes on for decades, for generations, and how are we playing a part today. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk about the forests of Oregon, forest ownership and management, make sure we're all kind of on the same page about understanding Oregon's forests, go into forest protections, and then some about future, our forest health and resiliency, along with future opportunities and challenges. I want to note that I'm going to throw a lot of facts and figures at you today to kind of help give a baseline. All of this is in our publications, Oregon Forest Facts. And then our newest publication, which is Sourcing from Sustainable Forests. Those are both on the back table, always available to order from OFRI. And so just want you to not try and capture this all. Know that you have those available to you. And as mentioned, this presentation is available as well. So how much forest is out there? This is probably something most of you hopefully have seen before, but just to give us all an idea that we're talking about half the state. And especially in the western half, it's pretty dominant. It's really hard to drive just about anywhere that you don't go by or through or see Oregon forest. And so that's about for half the state. And those that are the other half of the state's into things, right? The urban, the agriculture, rangelands. But what I want to focus for right here is when we talk about sustainability, one of the things we want to think about is not how much forest we have today, but how much forest we had in the past and how much forest we're trying to keep in the state in the future. And so this is one of the trends we actually look at is how many forest lands overall in the state have we been able to maintain. And in Oregon, that number's stayed relatively even for a long time. And we're going to talk about today, that's part about how we sustain Oregon's forest is some of the factors. And so one of the key parts about sustainability that we think about at OFRI is keeping forests as forest. And that's whether you're harvesting or not, but even if you're harvesting, is still keeping that forest land as forest and not moving them into a different type of use on that land. So this is really one of the core terms we think about for sustainability is about keeping that forest as forest. In Oregon, this sustainability really started back in the 70s, really started to take off thinking about our protections, about how to keep Oregon forested. As we were especially development in the 70s, if you look, a lot of our homes were built in the 70s. And so this Oregon has some really high land use laws. So the first started in 1974, and it really wanted to identify and designate forest lands and place development restrictions. And we have that on forest lands, we have that on agriculture lands. And so this picture is from another state that doesn't necessarily have land use laws. And so that's one of the mechanisms Oregon has had for a long time. And we sometimes forget because they were done 50 years ago. But those now are sometimes also in conflict as we're trying to, we see our population growing as a state. Where are we building? This is a lot of times a struggle for Oregonians to balance thinking about that. We want our forests, we want our agriculture lands, but where do we put new houses? Where are we putting condos? How are we growing? So this is one of those kind of always at attention of, I think, for Oregonians to think about. So if we think about those half the state forested, what kind of forests do we have? And this also makes it interesting if you think about not all the state is the same. So these are really general, but generally along the coast, we know we have a lot more of like a hemlock spruce type of forest. And then we move into our Douglas fir, the green. And then in a lot of our southern Oregon, up into the Cascades, we have up here in the Cascades, we have this red that we get more of our ponderosa pine and our mixed conifer species, and then a lot of mixed conifers along with ponderosa pine in other parts in the eastern Oregon. So I'm excited. Lucas is here, and he's going to talk a lot more about this corner of the state, which a lot of students and a lot of us don't get to as often as we maybe like to. And so this is an exciting opportunity for students to learn about different parts of the state with this Envirothon this year. But generally thinking, we have really distinct areas of different forest growing. And that plays into what I want to share with about who owns the forest. So most of you probably know, but our federal government, so U.S. Forest Service, BLM, those are our largest lands. So they own about 60% of the state. And then the next we have large private and then small private. And state's only about 4%. And then we have tribal. And so if you look at this across the landscape, these are the kind of where it shapes up. So where do we see a lot of the federal? Cascades. Yeah, so a lot of our national forests are the Cascades, which if you remember, a lot of that's that mixed conifer forest. So they have a lot of that mixed conifer. Where do we see a lot of our large private? Coast range. What's our main species that we're growing in the Coast Range? Yeah, we grow all the species. We know people are planting back multiple, but Douglas fir dominates that landscape. And if you're thinking about a lot of our large private, probably are a lot of where our wood's coming from. Why is Douglas fir not only our state tree, but does anybody know anything about Douglas fir for building? Why do people like to use it for construction? Any ideas? Go for it. They grow pretty straight. That's a nice thing for a board. It grows pretty straight. They grow pretty fast. So in Oregon, especially in this Coast Range, the Coast Range has some of the highest site productivity in the world. So Douglas fir is a sun-loving tree, which seems odd for Oregon, but it loves a combination of sun and our weather, our rain. And so if it gets that combination of sun and rain, and it grows out in that open, it can really grow pretty well. But the thing about Douglas fir is it's also, for construction, still a softwood, but it is very made into a lot of variety of different products and holds up well for a variety of the different products we'd make from it. So in that, it kind of makes sense if you start looking about who owns the forest, where they own it. And this has changed a lot over time, but primarily if we think about, sometimes it goes back to those uses. And then our state forest, those are in some pretty predominant areas, especially up in the Northwest, the Tillamook State Forest and the Clatsop, and then a couple other areas. Tribal is our fastest growing group that is actually actively increasing. So the tribals have started to increase quite a bit of their land base. And so this just kind of gave you a foundation for how much forest we have, who owns the forest, why they might want to own in that area, what type of trees we have. Obviously, we have over 36 more species, native species in Oregon. So that map was pretty general, but just to kind of give you an idea, I'll just pause there if there's any questions about kind of just that foundation about Oregon's forest. All right, so for most of you, that's probably a pretty quick review. So let's get into about sustainable forests, and we're talking about this word, sustainability. We say that word a lot. Everybody has a little bit different definition about how we think about it, but for us today, we're gonna talk about sustainability and often thinking about kind of that triangle, or some people say the three legs of the stool, and so the environmental, social, and economic benefits. And how do we balance all three of those things from Oregon's forest and still be sustainable? And so trying to meet those needs of today while also thinking about the future generations. And so we're going to walk through each of these today, thinking about these a little bit. And we're going to start with economic. And often when we start with economic, I like to start thinking about forest management, because a lot of the economic starts with thinking about forestry, forest management. How are we managing Oregon's forest? So in general, forest management, it's about the process of planting, planning, growing, the timing, the harvesting, or if you choose to leave it grow. So it's really about thinking about those diverse objectives of the landowners, but also society. If you think a large part of our forest in Oregon is owned by the federal government, which is trying to be reflective of society. In really general terms, we can also think about what maybe kind of management there is. So every landowner has their own objectives, but generally we're just gonna, for this conversation, think about them in terms of maybe reserve. So these are areas where we maybe aren't really doing much management. We just have decided to set that aside, have it for a specific purpose, and that has some distinct goals. Often, probably our older habitats, a lot of our old growth are in these reserves. And then a lot of, I'd say majority fall in multiple resource, where this is where you're trying to do multiple things and a lot of benefits from that land. And then we have some that are in wood production is their dominant, while also they're providing wildlife habitat, water protections, and many other things. So this is just thinking about how might we look at the forest, and in general terms, just looking at trends, what we try and look at is, if we take about that management and ownership, where might that fall out? And so we know in Oregon that we have different landowners with different objectives doing different things. And so that's going to fall out on that trend line in different places. And again, these will change for when you get really specific, but just generally we can kind of look and see. And so in Oregon, we have this Oregon plan, and there's groups, we look at it as well as with the Oregon Department of Forestry to see as a whole state, how is this falling out? And so generally, and often surprising to people, we actually see Oregon's forests break into about a third each, and for the whole state. And a lot of people think, well, that doesn't feel right. And it probably doesn't if you're thinking about a specific area of this state. If you're up on in the Cascades, it might feel, right, that's a lot more wilderness reserves compared to if you're at the Coast Range, it might feel a lot more wood production. Or if you're in Southern Oregon, it might feel a lot more of other things. So oftentimes that feeling we have of the forest we know may not match this, but if we look generally at all the forests of the state and we look at those primary objectives, it tends to actually break up into about thirds. One of the things that we know is this doesn't always stay the same. Forests and the people that own them are also dynamic, and so this can change over time. And that's part of trying to categorize a dynamic thing that's growing and changing. And so it's really hard sometimes to always talk about in general terms, but this is just kind of give you an idea about that. And so one of the things we think about when we think about sustainability is where are we getting our wood from and how much forest is growing. And so this is just kind of a unique comparison to take a look at. If about 60% of our state is owned federally, so I brought this back up, the forest land acreage by owner. This is where most of our harvest is coming from. And so that 60% is generating about 13% of harvest. The 35% here is your bulk of the harvest. So most of the harvest in Oregon is coming from the private lands, both large and small. So what's that mean for housing? In Oregon, we keep hearing we have a housing crisis. So this is my head scratcher. We have a housing crisis. We have wood available, but there's obviously a lot of barriers. And so this is a part where people are coming together to think about how can we think here locally about some of these solutions to help meet these needs of housing and development, while also thinking about where that wood's coming from. And so in Oregon, just to give you a little bit further back on timber harvest, the one I showed you was a snapshot of current harvest. But if we go back, here is into the 1980s, which for some of us doesn't seem long ago, but is longer than we think, 40 years. And so this orange line is federal forest land. So it used to be our primary place we were getting our products. And then in the mid 80s and then into 90s, that had a drastic reduction and has stayed pretty fairly level down here since then. This is the large private forest land where we noted most of our forest coming from. And so if you look at this, about 3 billion board feet, this has actually been a pretty even trend. So although it goes up and down each year, if you look over time, it's a pretty even. So if you think about, we know, looking at growth models, that we're growing a lot more forest than we're harvesting. And we've actually had a pretty even for some time, since about 20, 30 years, of a pretty even look at where harvest levels have been. And so generally, if you think about here in the 1980s, the Forest Service, BLM, those federal lands were actively harvesting. They were replanting because they had the anticipation that this type of management was going to continue. And so what we find now, and when we look at growth models, is we have a lot of growth that is happening in federal forests and is kind of out of balance for how drastically we stopped harvesting. And so now at this point is where we're at, where we're looking at what does that mean? How some areas may be overcrowded, some areas may be not quite in sync in the same maybe species that would have traditionally been there. And so this has become a lot of the focus about forest resiliency and health, is how are we getting those forests kind of back into a balance. It's not all about harvesting, but we know that it's there's been a lot of changes. And so that's part of that sustainability conversation, is about why is this happening now? And it's like, well, forests continue to grow in Oregon, and we grow them well here. and we stopped kind of with one. We had one vision, and that stopped abruptly, and it's taken some time for us to kind of look at that full impact. So we mentioned board feet a lot. This is another one of my pause to make sure we understand terminology, because when we talk about board feet, and if you go out with foresters and we talk about board feet, so a board foot is just generally a 12 by 12 by 1. And in forestry world, it's always fun that we're taking a round object and trying to measure it into squares. So it's some good geometry. So this is just a terminology of a way that we measure forest. And in general, if you see that load of log trucks, it's usually between 3,000 to 4,000 board feet. So just kind of give you some reference. We threw some numbers out this morning, but want to give a little reference on that. So in Oregon, you saw harvest trends, harvest levels. We still are the #1 producer of softwood lumber and plywood production in the U.S. So even with the great reduction of how much we're harvesting over time, we still have maintained that level because we have mills that also have become really efficient at production. A lot of technology and engineering and things that have gone into that type of production line. So we still grow a lot of forest in Oregon, but we're harvesting way less than we're growing. But even at that level, we're still able to maintain, if you think about those economic benefits, especially in a lot of our rural areas of Oregon, this economy is really important for us. The other part about sustainability that's really important in forestry is our workforce. So we can't do this type of work, the economic benefits for communities, without workforce. And that's probably the one that we actually are most concerned about with sustainability is who's coming into the workforce. We know we have over 62,000 living wage jobs. We're continually trying to evaluate that. But a lot of work and dedication is going into what's that next generation. And so I would encourage, there's a lot of great opportunity. This is my plug if any students watch this later, to consider the careers in forestry. It's really rewarding, but it's really needed to help solve some of these complex issues. And although it seems messy at times, it really can be rewarding as you're helping really think about Oregon's forests and how we're going to sustain them in the future. So that's about our economic benefits and my plug for workforce. Any questions we've had so far on, I'll pause for anything on economic benefits.
Because when I talk about balance in our forest, it's like, wow, they're pretty packed. There's a lot of fuel in there, and it feels like that is a very tangible speaking point about balance and just dead breaker fuels in the forest.
So that would stem back to what are your objectives, right? So for a lot of landowners, that balance it's all gonna come back to what are your objectives. If your objective is forest health, fire resiliency, maybe your objective might be then your action was to reduce how many trees per acre. But it's going to come back to objectives. So a lot of our private landowners are often doing that. What's my objectives? And are my actions help meeting those objectives? For federal government, that gets a little messy because we have millions of people living in the U.S. who think they have ownership into those. And if we even did a survey in this room on exactly how many trees per acre should we leave in national forest, everyone's gonna have a different opinion. And especially if you think about each forest is different. And each forest should be looked at what it's providing, what is growing there, what is its risk. And so we're gonna talk more about that. And that's part of the excitement we have for the Envirothon question this year is your students get to look at an example that they're doing in Oregon where they're asking just that. Is this forest healthy? Is it balanced? Should we do some ecological restoration? What's our goals and objectives? And so landowners are doing that when they think about their actions. But when we talk about national forests, then we get a lot of layers of policies and politics and a lot of extremes that sometimes have voices, but often we're trying to get to what's the best for that forest at this time moving forward. So a lot of what I've just presented was baselines for where we are in Oregon as a snapshot today. And so I like to think people like, where do we want to go with that? Do we like the thirds? Do we want to see it different? How are we feeling about Oregon's forest? So those are baselines and facts that we can just help start those conversations. And a lot of times we try and get to prescriptions, but you first have to really think about what's our goal and objective. Thank you, Stephen. Good question. All right, thanks for the clarification. So we're going to move into this next layer, which is about the environmental benefits. And really, we think about in terms of sustainability. We know the forests are providing a lot of environmental benefits, but also how are we protecting those? And our question back was, how do we sustain Oregon's forests? And one of the key ways that we do that is through a lot of our regulations. And so we kind of developed this sustainability pyramid in the sense of looking at those kind of layers of protections. And so we have federal environmental regulations, things like shout out some of our environmental regulations. Endangered Species Act. Yeah, that's a really big one. Clean Water Act. Clean Air Act. Yes. So we have a lot of federal regulations that apply to all the states. And we have a lot of those regulations are in place. And then what's unique is each state gets to decide their own state protection regulations. And so we're going to talk about what those are. We're going to focus a little bit more about what those are in Oregon. And then if you also think about sustainability, groups may take it further than just pass the regulations. There may also be things like third-party certification. And then you also may have a tier above that of different programs. How many of you now have seen groups put out their sustainability program, right? Most companies now have sustainability programs. Some even printed on their packages or on their labels. So that's taking to another level of that sustainability. So in Oregon, we were the first state. We like to be number one on things. So we're the first state that put together laws governing the practice of forestry. Does anybody remember what year that was? Yeah, those are early 70s. So 1971 is when it was enacted. And so we really put in a whole set of laws that are set for any commercial activity in Oregon's forests on non-federal lands. So the state cannot tell the federal what to do, although we often like to try, but we can't tell them what to do, but we can regulate on any non-federal lands. So the Oregon Department of Forestry enforces those. We have stewardship foresters that go out and enforce these laws, but really more try and help people understand them and educate about them and help those forests be sustainable. So a few of the key provisions of these laws, the first one is reforestation. That started back in 1971, and reforestation has really been a bedrock about this, and really probably one of the ones that have been something that's really important. And we know in Oregon, we do this pretty well. We plant between 40 to 50 billion trees per year. And there's certain laws about how soon landowners need to replant, but then also they need to be free to grow. After 6 years, it means you can't just plant them. They actually have to still be growing and continuing. We also have a lot of our laws around water protection. So we're looking at how do we protect those resources. A lot of times those are done through what we call the buffers. So areas that are left alongside the streams. Now we have some pretty good sizes of no-touch buffers. You're not doing any activities in there. And so a lot of protections around water. And then our third area that a lot of our protections are around is wildlife habitat. So those are really important to the state and Oregonians. And so we protect wildlife in a lot of different ways. We also have requirements about leaving things like down logs, standing dead trees, both dead and alive, so green and snags. And so a lot of requirements also about, especially for birds in the nesting seasons, when they're roosting and other things. So this package, the Oregon Forest Protection Laws, is what helps govern how we're being sustainable in Oregon by having these laws. A few years ago, there was a look at really evolving the laws, and this group came together called the Private Forest Accord. The Private Forest Accord, we're now calling it Finding Common Ground. We have a publication on it if you want to learn more about it, but it was really about these extreme voices coming together to find compromise and a way path forward, which they did with what's called the Private Forest Accord goals. And it's really about creating business certainty, environmental certainty. They put together a process now where there's a science-driven adaptive management process for rules that go into in the future, so that science from a lot of different areas come together. And they also recognize some of these might be hard for small woodland owners, so trying to help navigate that. So we just saw the most major revision in this year, 2024, start in January of these laws. And so OFRI's been a big part of trying to help educate around that, but that's where a lot of energy is going right now, is to help Oregonians and forest landowners learn about these new laws. Sometimes it's interesting to step back and look at the U.S. and think about, when we think about sustainability, how is Oregon doing in the bigger picture? And so this is a study come out from Minnie Crandall at OSU, that she took a look at nationwide these forest regulations. And this is in, again, that publication sustaining from Oregon Forest. And so really the picture is, in the West, we are really dominated by this kind of regulatory work. In other parts, they have more best management practices. And then in other parts, they do it through licensing of foresters. And then in other parts, it's kind of this non-regulatory. Then there's quasi, means there's some regulations, but they may not have anyone that's overseeing them. And then you have California, who has kind of put it all together. So they have regulatory and licensing. So this kind of gives you a picture of where those look and how we compare with other states. And then if we move up in the sustainability triangle, thinking about how we sustaining Oregon's forest, a lot of organizations, especially the private organizations, look at this third-party certification. And in Oregon, generally it goes, there's generally these three. So this one might be one you see on a lot of our family forest lands. It's the American Tree Farm System. They aim a lot of our family forest lands to help them become certified. Sustainable Forestry Initiative, the SFI, and then we have the Forest Stewardship Council. And so those are our generally three leading certification programs in Oregon. And then if we think about the top of that triangle, so sustainability is often, the top one is the one that we love to see in Oregon, which is when you voluntarily do measures. They're above and beyond what would be regulations. And in Oregon, one of our longest running volunteer programs, this is again, many people don't know about it anymore, but it really was something started a few years ago, the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. If anyone remembers, a lot of people think it's not going. Well, it's still going. They gave out $112 million in the last couple of years for it. So this is still voluntary. A lot of our, especially private landowners, have still been investing millions of dollars into salmons and waterways. And there's still been a lot of investment by the state into salmon and waterways. And so if you think about sustainability, this is a really big program, is that voluntary sustainability, doing things and actions above just the regulations. So those are kind of the environmental benefits. If we think about in terms of sustainability, how are we measuring sustainability in Oregon is often by the protections we have and then the voluntary actions people are doing. So again, I'm happy to pause if anybody has any questions about those things. Okay, I can repeat the question. So you're asking, you can get your land certified by one of these organizations? It does. Yeah, so it's voluntary. So let's say the Rediscovery Forest up here, just a small 15-acre demonstration forest, we wanted to be certified, which shows that we're trying to, another way for us to document sustainability. And so we're certified under the family forest, primarily because that's for small acres of land. And so they have trained inspectors that come out for all of these programs. You have to have a forest management plan. So it tells you what's your objectives, where do you want your forest to go. It has an inventory of what's out there. It might be, what are your different goals and objectives? Are you meeting those regulations? So you don't have a long list of fines that you're it shows like what voluntary actions are you doing. And so you fill out your management plan, but then you fill out the application, and then a forester, an inspector, someone who's been certified by these different programs. For these really big programs, the SFI and Forest Stewardship Councils, those are often third-party groups that are maybe even coming in from other states. So they have audit teams that come in and audit the companies that are certified. And so oftentimes it's both what are you doing on the land. So a lot of times those inspections are tours, but you're going out and looking at what's happening on the land. And then you're looking at what's being planned, what's the actions, are they being good stewards? Some of these plans even include, right, like, are you sending your foresters for development? Are they certified foresters? Are they continually getting new information? And so a lot of that is spelled out. There's the primary difference you can look at between some of these happens to be just where they started. So SFI was more of started in the Western, or more in the U.S., and FSC started a lot in the European. And so it also just depends a little bit on what those values are. And what they are. And so that's where people choose which one. The American Tree Farm System, they can only take up to a certain size. So they're really more, I think it's like 10,000 acres or less, just because of they're more of a voluntary group that does a third party. Thank you. Good question about certification. A lot of, so a lot of times people are certifying their forest, but the mills will often also have a chain of command. And so if the mill is going to, or the product's going to be certified, they have to have a chain of command. They have to know if it came from a certified forest, if it was in a mill that also was to a certain standards, and then that product met certain standards as well. And so that whole system has to have a certain level of certification standards. And then they will also often promote that, trying to write is that part of that marketing, but also as a society, we're often asking for that, wanting to not have a lot of guilt when we're drinking our coffee from paper products. And so, this has been part of what society has asked for, and part of what the response has been to show sustainability, especially compared, in the U.S., we might be thinking state to state, but really certification was also started to think about making sure we weren't bringing in products that were illegally imported or using products that weren't coming from sustainable forests, like in other parts of the world where there's no regulations at all. And so a lot of that was trying to help starting to distinguish where you were buying from in order to try and also help stop maybe importing from countries where there's no regulations, no protections for workers. So a lot of these stem from that kind of society need to want to know about those as well. So that's what sometimes people get caught in the details of these. And I'll say, well, these all show sustainability, all show people who are trying to show and are proud of what they're doing. What we really should be looking at is those places that aren't any regulations at all. And are we continuing to support and use those from other areas that maybe are the conditions are much different? So that's really where we often try and look at. Does that answer your question? Okay. So this next level of sustainability, we're gonna go to the social aspect, and this is the part that's always fun because we as social means each of us have a different idea of what that benefit means. When I go to the forest and recreate, it might look different than your recreation, or it might look different than those who like to go out and sunbathing in the forest has become a thing, the forest bathing, compared to motorcycle riding. Those two sometimes don't meet very well. So recreation can look different to different things. But when you generally are thinking about, we at OFRI often look at like what are those values and beliefs of Oregonians overall. So we continually go out and do values and belief surveys to Oregonians to help make sure we're understanding what Oregonians are feeling about Oregon's forests. And these are continually things that we see society is valuing, but we also, on the other side, continue to see them come up in headlines and conversations because sometimes they're really complicated issues for us to search out. So water quality and quantity, wildfires are a concern, climate change and carbon, wildlife habitat's really important to Oregonians, housing's important, and we know workforce and that economic's also really important. So those are things that we know are important to Oregonians, are on top of mind for Oregonians, and we also know are some of our most complicated issues that we are dealing with today as a society. So things like we're making a lot of strides to try and do renewable energy. We've been really aggressive in Oregon and on the West to try and do renewable energy. And then you see headlines like this. Wildfires have offset 20 years of air quality gains in the U.S. West. 20 years. That's more than some of your students have been here. So these are those complicated issues where we feel we're making good strides, and then things like catastrophic wildfires have happened. This has really gained the attention a few years ago when we had the Oregon wildfires, the 2020 Labor Day fires. And why did this catch? So this burned, right, a million acres in a couple days. So does anybody know, was the wildfire season this year worse or better than that year in the terms of acres? Did this year's generate as many headlines? Yeah, so these catastrophic wildfires, this was a really catastrophic year. One, it really hit a lot of communities. It was tragic, and it really had a lasting impact, but it was also on the west side. This year we had over 2 million acres of fire. We had close to 2 million acres of fire this year, but our neighbors in the east was the brunt of it. So it was a lot of both range and forest land. So these headlines continue to go. It just sometimes the conversation depends on where it was in the backyard. But when we talk about carbon and climate change, why is forest a part of these conversations? And it really comes to carbon sequestration, right? So this is something, what's wood made of? That's my favorite question to ask students nowadays. What's wood made of? Because OFRI did a panel a few years ago with Oregonians, and we basically asked, what's wood made of? Where's carbon going in trees? And not very many Oregonians can understood that half of the tree is made up of carbon. So I implore you to make sure your students know photosynthesis, the full equation. So most of the time they're really good at telling us trees give us oxygen, and they forget that second half, and we ask, where does the carbon go? And so if we're talking about climate change, we're talking about carbon. This is a key part of the conversation is the carbon is in the tree, and the tree is sequestering that. And so when we make this into products, our houses are sequestering carbon. This building sequestering carbon, right? So trees are a really important part of that climate change conversation, are a very important part of carbon conversation. Sometimes it's forgotten because we're not doing that whole equation. So just that reminder that we have carbon as in forest, and it's reminded of us when we see headlines like when we have wildfires. But we also, on the other side, can store that carbon when we're using products and things. So carbon in Oregon's managed forests, these are some kind of some things that we were talking about today with the new issue. Climate change is happening. Science has shown there's an atmospheric carbon, that increase is happening. But a part of what we're challenging is how do forest ecosystems and wood products, how do they have a potential to be part of this solution? And is intentional forest management, or what might be called now more adaptable forestry, the key for forest health? That's the question that we're asking in Envirothon, and that's the question really society is asking, right? Is how do we bring all of these kind of issues together, thinking about carbon, climate change, wildfires, housing, our need for maybe more forest health and resiliency. And so is maybe adaptable management where we're trying to manage areas to meet their needs really important. And so this really came to home. This is another highly debated topic, a map. I don't know how many headlines this map has gotten, but simply mapping the state of Oregon and our forest at risk has become really, people have some real feelings about this. And so when they put together models, they looked at flame links, where we are as far as overcrowding, the opportunity for fire. This is what's put together for the statewide wildfire hazard map. So this is just a mapping exercise, but people are really concerned because if you live in one of those high hazard areas, they're concerned what your insurance will do and what it will mean you have to do. And one of the things I tell you is the insurance companies already had these. They already knew. But it's definitely a concern for Oregonians, and it's making us talk about it. And if you lived in the WUI, those boundaries, over 70,000 Oregonians received a letter last week telling them they lived in the WUI boundary and they're going to actually need to do some things to make sure their property is getting ready for reducing wildfire. So this has now come literally to a head in Oregon that we're saying this is such a big crisis impact about our forest at risk. We just sent letters to people. Is that the best way to educate people? And that's why panic has a bit pursued about people, because when we just do a big mapping, we don't know what that person has already done. And so some people that are upset is because they've already maybe spent a lot of time and energy trying to prepare their home and their property, but they still get that letter. Or there's people who don't want to hear from the government a letter telling them they have to do something. So there's a lot. The reason that this map generated a lot of that is because there was outcomes of it, but we also, this is the important about education, and where we like to come back to is helping Oregonians, including our students, realize some of this that Oregon's facing, some of these really hard, complex topics about how are we engaging all Oregonians in this conversation about our forest at risk, and what do they want, and what are we asking the foresters on the ground to do. So this was released, and then while this seems overwhelming that we have a lot of high hazard, one of the things that is very simple is we think about, it's all about fire, wildfire hazard. But if you really break it down, fire as a triangle, a lot of triangles today, I recognize. Fire triangle, right? You have oxygen, heat, and fuel. So oxygen is pretty much exists everywhere. We don't do a lot to change that. Heat, where does most of our heat come in forest? What's starting most of our fires? Lightning, people. So we can't predict lightning too much. We know sometimes it's coming. But heat, that's why there's avid campaigns about trying to reduce people doing having fires in the forest, right? So that's a big campaign. But the one thing we can do ahead of time is fuel. So we can do fuel management, and that is why fuel, what we might call fuel treatments, is such a key part of the conversation we have around forest resiliency and health today. So if we're thinking about reducing that high risk, a lot of what we're talking about is fuel treatments. And fuel treatments is really what we're talking about. How and what do we want the forest to look like to be resilient and to be healthy? And so today I'm very excited because Lucas is going to set that up for you, what they're doing on the ground to do some fuel treatments and what they're thinking about. And so just kind of as an overview, a lot of times these fuel treatments and actions are being called, right, we're looking at restoration, we're looking at enhancement. We're trying to look at what are those natural and ecological functions and what are some of those actions that we're going to do. Maybe it's reducing the fuels. Maybe it's even a prescribed burns, stream restorations. How are we keeping those forests and forest land, and how are we keeping them healthy? And sometimes in Oregon, we're even looking at the solution of using those when we're reducing fuel. How are we using those small diameter maybe to build something we need in Oregon, like our houses or buildings? And so, what I would say is that Oregon has really been looking at kind of this, looking at mass timber as part of this conversation equation of if we have a lot of wildfire risk, we're trying to reduce some fuels in areas. How can we use some of that to build and to make things that Oregonians need? And the cool thing about mass timber is this has come on. It's been really big in Europe. It's been really big in other areas of the world. In Oregon, we've been a leader in it. And so looking at building large things, which we've used large timbers in Oregon for years. Look at Timberline Lodge. But this is trying to use, how do we use smaller diameter to create those bigger products? And we have the technology and efficiencies and innovations to do this. And so they're starting to build bigger structures, multiple story structures with mass timber. Portland's gotten some, other areas of the West have gotten some. And so one of the things that we are also lucky in Oregon that they have built is the tallwood design, and down at OSU, the research and innovation. And so this is in that building. This is the research lab can hold a 3-story building, like pieces of it. And so they're doing a test on earthquake. They've also done a lot of tests on fire, because when people think of wood, they think about fire. And one of the things they found is actually these mass timbers, because they're so big, they will burn, but they'll then start to just hold that burn and slowly burn in. And if you think about a campfire, when you put a big chunk on, it takes a long time, right? You call them those all-nighters that just burn and burn and burn. Well, it's the same in our buildings. It allows actually the time for people to evacuate and get out. And they're finding that it's even a longer time for that than even some steel and other structures, because steel, once it's compromised, it completely just fails. And so they're actually finding it works pretty well. For earthquakes, the really cool thing, if you get a chance, if you're down at OSU, the College of Forestry, they also have a new mass timber building. Their whole back stairwell, they left the walls basically exposed so you can look inside. And the whole building's a living laboratory. They've hooked it up with thousands of wires, and they're continually monitoring the building to learn about the mass timber. But one of the things that came out of New Zealand, they've had some major earthquakes, and what they were finding is they couldn't reoccupy their buildings because of the compromise of the walls. And so they came up with these fasteners that hold the basically the different stories together. And the way the fasteners work is it's a metal bracket, but they give, and then when it's done swaying, it snaps back into place. And what they're finding is they can basically after big earthquakes, it's an opportunity for this technology to, then you can reoccupy the building versus whole towns that have to be rebuilt. So there's not only a lot of technology into the wood and the building, but how we're putting buildings together. And so one of the biggest groups that is really investing in mass timber is the Portland Airport. Anyone have a chance to go through there yet? Yeah, some of the holiday travelers. So the Port of Portland actually owns quite a bit of land up in Portland, and they have invested a lot in mass timber, and they're part of the Oregon Mass Timber Coalition, as is OSU and others, the Department of Forestry. And so the Port of Portland has invested in using mass timber and timber into this new project. So they built a 4-acre ceiling that is basically using these different engineering techniques, but also their architects wanting to make it very visually appealing. When we toured through there, they told us they want to keep you all calm while you're traveling, and Woodward would do that. And so they really invested in this idea of mass timber, but even more, the Port of Portland invested in the idea of using local. So I started the presentation thinking about how we use local to build, we're kind of back to that. The Port of Portland used everything wood-wise came within 300 miles of the project. And so that was a really important piece for them, was using local to build local, to feature that for all the people who are traveling from around the world. So these type of scenarios, in that publication that is back there, we put together a publication about how our Oregon's forest helping to be sustainable, but helping to build these type of projects. And so we have a lot more case studies in there. And so I would encourage you with your students, if you're looking for more case studies of this, we've put that together in the publication, including this one on the airport about how they're hoping to help Oregon's forests and sustainability by using local and by using the products. So with that, I'm happy to answer. Thanks, Ricky's holding it up. I'm happy to answer more questions or thoughts you might have. Yeah, I think the Tallwood Building Institute, so they actually have been starting to put together classes. And so I think they have some labs. If not, we can try and ask them to help put those out. Yeah, so it's down with the OSU College of Forestry. And it's the, am I getting that right? Tallwood Building Institute. Yeah, Tallwood Building Institute. But if you pick up the publication that Ricky was holding, there's a whole thing in there about it. So, and then Marcus Kaufman with the Oregon Department of Forestry was here yesterday. And there's a really great website called the Promise of Mass Timber that Oregon Department of Forestry and the Oregon Mass Timber Coalition put together. And they have some great videos on there talking about this, about how all these are coming together. I also would encourage you to go out on a tour. Up in Portland, there's a new facility called Timber Lab. And Timber Lab is who provided most of, was kind of the place where a lot of this came in to convene to go out to the airport. There's also, they have some things online, but really the College of Forestry and the Oregon Mass Timber Coalition has put quite a few things online. And if you need more resources, we can try and help find those as well. And then as mentioned, Marcus Kaufman, who was here yesterday, I think he also offered his presentation for you guys to use. Have the Timber Lab, ask the Timber Lab guys, they had a whole bin. So we went and toured it. They had a whole bin of ends that they were just offering. You could basically just take with you. So I would say you could take some of those and take them back to your classroom if you're already going there. And ask this of the Timber Lab guys. They were great. They were really, they're a young, energetic crew. And so I'm guessing you will be able to fill the bus with samples. Order a bigger bus. Even people from our group were just randomly taking, they're just a cool big, like sometimes the ends are different things that they had to cut. We're taking them, they're pretty fun. Yeah, thanks, good question. Go for it. So I'm not an architect, so I'm not gonna claim I know that on everything. What I generally know is what they're finding is it's pretty comparable, but where they're on construction sites, where they're finding the economic benefits of it is these, all of these, so the mass timber are manufactured and CNC'd, and so they're put together kind of like Legos. And so the part is once you have those crews out there, especially if you're in areas where you're having to close streets or bring in cranes, which are really expensive, they can put together, just basically snap all of those stories together pretty quickly. And they already have in the holes for the wiring, they have in the holes for the lighting. So all of that's already predetermined. So a lot more of the work happens in the lab and happens beforehand. So when it gets to the construction site, they're not also trying to store or haul those big beams or things down. They're coming in one, basically like a, kind of like a puzzle of like, here's story level 1, piece 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're putting those together. So that's where we're hearing that the economic benefits are helping a lot for that. The other thing that we're hearing is that they like working with the material, but the end product, right? People are like living in those type of aesthetic, so kind of meeting the needs of the customers. And then just also, a lot of people are choosing this because, again, they know the sources. They can choose to buy wood that's come locally or from certifications or different things. And so I think as we do more of these, they're hoping that economy comes even better. The big thing that was the first struggles was the workforce, people to put these together. And so there has been a lot of training in Portland, and that's what the Port of Portland and the Oregon Mass Timber Coalition is actually building a mass timber campus in Portland, on some Port of Portland land. It's off the river, and they're going to be building. U of O is focusing on housing out of mass timber. OSU has some of their labs going in there. There's an acoustic lab. So they've actually received millions of dollars in grants, including investing in workforce. So Portland Community College is investing in a new workforce program around mass timber because of seeing just such the need, but also the potential for its future. So great question. I don't know the exact details, but I think there's always those things that on every project, they're looking at those different benefits, and they're trying to drive it even more by teaching more people how to build with them. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Thank you for being part of Oregon Envirothon. We love it, and we really appreciate that you're all here. Thank you for listening about Oregon's forests. And we don't have all the answers, but we certainly appreciate that you're thinking about these, thinking about the future, thinking about how we're talking about and maybe tackling these really complicated and important issues. So really, I think there's just so much great opportunity, and people really care about the forest in Oregon. That's why so many of us are passionate about finding the path forward. And that's what I see as the next generation when I talk to folks that are thinking about this, is they really see an opportunity that they can make a big impact, because there's still so much for us to know and do out on the lands. And so just really encourage you all to dig into these and appreciate that. And I'm around if you have any more questions.